The morning the market square remembered was a Tuesday in late October, when the sky above Ashworth hung low and iron gray, and the smell of frost had already settled into the cobblestones the way it always did. When November thought to arrive early, she was standing at the linen draper's stall, her back very straight, her gloves mended at the left thumb, and not quite mended enough at the right. When they came, there were 4 of them. Lady Conworth led, in a pelisse of deep plum, trimmed with ermine, the kind of ermine that requires a husband who has not mismanaged his estate. At her left shoulder moved Miss Cecily Vane, 20 years old, and diamond white, and utterly certain of her place in the world, which was to say the place directly in front of every other woman in any room she entered. Behind them, half attending, half absorbed in her own reflection, in the draper's window glass drifted another of Lady Conworth's collection. And at the rear, already smiling the way one smiles when one knows the entertainment is about to begin, walked Mrs. Pelling, who had no particular cruelty of her own, but was an excellent audience for other people's. Nora Cavendish did not turn. She had learned, these past 7 months, to hear Lady Conworth's footstep at 20 paces, and to arrange her expression before the confrontation could arrange it for her. Miss Cavendish. Lady Conworth's voice had the particular precision of a woman who had spent 40 years being obeyed. I did not think the market was your province on Tuesdays. Nora turned then, because not to turn would be interpreted as weakness, and because she would not give the woman that satisfaction. Good morning, Lady Conworth. The lady's gaze moved across Nora with the economy of a customs agent inspecting freight, the mended glove, the gray wool pelisse that had been let out once at the seams and pressed very carefully to conceal it. The basket over Nora's arm, which contained nothing luxurious. How she persists, Lady Conworth said, and the words were not addressed to Nora, but to Miss Vane, who absorbed them with the delicate pleasure of a woman receiving a gift she had been expecting. A portionless bride, who never was a bride at all, still shopping, still pretending. One must admire the nerve at least. Miss Vane's smile was cool and complete. One must, she agreed. Nora held her spine very still. The draper's boy at the counter had gone busy with a bolt of muslin. He did not need to refold. The woman at the stall beside them had found something of absorbing interest in a tray of buttons. The market square did what crowds always do when a public diminishment is underway. It pretended not to notice, and it listened to every word. She purchased her linen. She counted out the coins with steady hands. She said good morning to the draper, who had the decency to look at her with something almost like apology, and she walked away across the cobblestones with her back straight and her chin level, and the word persists sitting in her chest like a stone someone had placed there with great deliberate care. If you have ever stood in a public place while someone dismantled your dignity, piece by piece, and felt the particular cold of being unmade in front of witnesses, then you already understand the shape of this morning. If you have not, stay close. Nora Cavendish had come to Ashworth 7 months earlier, with a trunk, a letter of reference, and nothing else worth naming. Her father, the late Captain Cavendish, had left behind 3 things of substance: a mounted print of his regiment, a letter of affection written to her mother 20 years before her birth, and discovered in a drawer after the funeral, and a debt to his solicitor of £112 that the solicitor had presented to Nora before the crepe had been taken down. The house in Bath had been rented. There was no other house. She was 24. She had a good education, a passable talent at the pianoforte, and the ability to speak French without embarrassing herself, which were precisely the qualifications a woman of her situation was expected to convert into income. Mrs. Alderton of Ashworth Hall had required a governess for her 2 younger children, and Nora had required a position, and that particular arithmetic had resolved itself into a letter of engagement and a coach north, and the trunk now residing in the upper corridor of the West Wing. Ashworth Hall sat 3 miles from the town, inside a park wall that had been built in the reign of a king whose name nobody in the household could quite agree on. The house itself was not elegant. It was large and serious, and it had the quality of a place that had stood through several generations of difficulty and had not been impressed by any of them. Mrs. Alderton was a widow, managing the estate on behalf of her eldest son, who was at university, and not due to inherit for 2 more years. She was not unkind, but she was precise, and she ran the household with the same attention she gave to the account books, which is to say, very closely and with very little sentiment. The children were Hugh, who was 9 and solemn and liked to catalogue insects, in a small leather notebook, and Dora, who was 7, and liked to argue about everything with the focused intensity of a barrister in miniature. Nora found them tolerable. She found their curiosity better than tolerable. She spent her mornings with them in the schoolroom and her afternoons at whatever tasks the household required, and she spent her evenings in the small sitting room assigned to her, which had a window that looked east and a fireplace that worked, and a chair that was comfortable if you sat in it at a particular angle. The Marquess of Alderton arrived in the 3rd week of October, and nobody had told her he was coming. She had been in the kitchen garden with Dora, who had decided that the correct use of a Tuesday afternoon was the examination of the last surviving chrysanthemums, when the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel came through the gate. Nora straightened. Dora turned, and from behind the box hedge came a voice that carried the particular resonance of a man who had never had cause to raise it and had therefore never developed the habit. "Dora, you are in the kitchen garden again." The man who came around the corner of the hedge was tall in the way. That seems more like density than height, as though the same frame had simply been built more thoroughly than average. He had dark hair that had been resisting its arrangement since at minimum that morning, a jaw that looked as though it had been cut from something geological, and gray eyes that moved across the kitchen garden with the efficiency of a man cataloging what needed to be attended to. They stopped on Nora. She had her hands in the soil. She was wearing her oldest working gown, the brown one with the ink stain on the left cuff that would never fully come out, and her hair was pinned with the particular imprecision that accumulates over an afternoon of outdoor activity. She was, in short, not at her best. "Miss Cavendish," Dora announced with great satisfaction, "is teaching me about root systems, how they hold things in the ground." The man's gaze did not move. "Is she?" he said. "She is," Dora said. "She says everything that looks alive above the ground is only alive because of what you cannot see beneath it." Something crossed the gray eyes then, very briefly. Not amusement, precisely, but the acknowledgement of something that had surprised him. He looked at Nora a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Miss Cavendish," he said. "My lord." She was already pulling off her working gloves and rising, which was awkward because she had been kneeling. She managed it without falling over, which she counted as a success. "I am told you have been managing the schoolroom since August, and—" "Since the 16th of August, my lord. My mother speaks well of your work. Mrs. Alderton is generous, my lord." He studied her for another moment with those gray eyes that gave nothing away, and then he said, "Come inside when you are finished. Mrs. Alderton will want to arrange introductions properly." He walked back around the box hedge, and the sound of his boots on the gravel diminished, and Nora looked at Dora, who was watching her with 7-year-old intensity. "That is my brother Edmund," Dora said. "I gathered," Nora said. "He is not usually here." "No," Nora said, and retrieved her gloves. Edmund Alderton, Marquess of Alderton, had been, not usually, here for the better part of 2 years, which was how long it had been since his wife had died. The household did not discuss it directly. There were the particular silences in rooms, and the portrait in the long gallery that no one stopped in front of, and Mrs. Alderton's way of referring to her son's absence with a careful neutrality that acknowledged everything and explained nothing. Nora had learned the outline from the kitchen, as one learns most things in a house. Lady Alderton had died in the spring of 1814, in her confinement, and the child had not survived either, and the Marquess had gone north to a property in Cumberland and had not come back, until now. He moved through the house like a man remembering a language he had spoken fluently, and then stopped speaking. He knew where everything was, and he attended to the business of the estate with swift, organized attention, and he sat at the head of the dinner table in the evenings, when he dined with his mother in the formal way, and Nora took her meals in her sitting room, and did not observe any of this firsthand. She heard it, because a house of this size is never actually quiet. And because Hugh had decided that the Marquess was a subject worth reporting on with the same meticulous energy he brought to the insect catalogue. "He rode out to the south field today," Hugh would announce at lessons. "He spoke to Grayson about the drainage. He said the north field wants a third of what they think it wants." "Very good," Nora would say. "Now, the conjugation of vouloir. He asked about the schoolroom," Hugh said one morning very casually. Nora looked up from the French grammar. "Did he?" He asked whether you were strict. "And what did you tell him?" "I said you were fair," Hugh said with the gravity of a 9-year-old who has considered the question carefully, "which is not the same thing." "No," Nora agreed. "It is not." She did not know he had been watching her. She had no reason to think it, and her wound had taught her not to expect to be watched with any quality of real attention. Her father's death had stripped away the last external evidence that she was someone whose situation mattered to the world, and the 7 months since had confirmed what she had already begun to suspect in the last years of her father's illness, the knowledge that a woman without money is a woman without outline, a shape that the room arranges itself around without quite registering as a presence. She was not self-pitying about this. She was, in fact, quite precise about it, which is a different thing. She knew what she was worth in the market of the season, and she had made her peace with the arithmetic. And she asked nothing from the Marquess's household, except the occupation of her position and the small fire in the evening. She did not know about the evening in the library. She had gone to return a volume of Cowper that Dora had borrowed without permission, slipping it back into its place on the lower shelf in what she believed was an empty room. The fire was low, the candles on the writing table had burned to their last quarter-inch, and at the far end of the room, standing with his back to her, at the window, his hands clasped behind him, stood the Marquess. She had not made a sound. She might have retreated without his knowing she had been there. She did not, because the book in her hand had a spine that caught the firelight when she moved, and he turned. "Miss Cavendish," he said, and something in his voice was different from its usual register. Quieter, the authority still there, but the composure was not quite in its usual arrangement. "Forgive me, my lord. I was returning Dora's borrowing." She held up the Cowper. "I did not know the room was occupied." "Stay," he said. It was not a request. She stayed. He turned back to the window. Outside, the park was black and silver under a late October moon, the elms standing like columns with most of their leaves gone. "How long have you been at Ashworth, Miss Cavendish?" 2 months, my lord." "Do you find it suits you?" She considered this with the honesty she could not quite prevent in quiet rooms. "I find the children worth the work, my lord." "And the rest?" "The rest is adequate," she said. "Which is more than I require." He turned from the window then. His face in the firelight was less composed than she had seen it in any other room. And she understood, in the way that understanding arrives sometimes before the mind can trace its path, that she was seeing him in a moment he had not arranged for an audience. "My wife read Cowper," he said. "She preferred the task to everything else." Nora said nothing. The fire settled. "The portrait in the gallery is not a good likeness," he said, as though this were a necessary correction to some error she might make. She was not severe. She had a way of laughing that she could not contain. She would cover her mouth with her hand and it would come through anyway. He stopped, his hands still clasped behind him, tightened briefly and then released. "I am sorry for your loss, my lord," Nora said. The words were inadequate, but inadequate words offered honestly are better than precise ones offered from a distance. He looked at her, not the efficient inventory she had grown accustomed to from him, but a different quality of attention, as though he were actually seeing her, and what he saw was something he had not expected to find here. "Good night, Miss Cavendish," he said. "Good night, my lord." She returned the Cowper to its place, and went to her sitting room, and sat in the chair at its comfortable angle and stared at the fire and thought about what roots hold in the ground that the surface cannot see. She told herself with some precision that this was not the beginning of anything. She was a governess. He was a Marquess with a wound that had not finished healing. The hierarchy existed, and it was not romantic scaffolding. It was a structure that carried real weight, and she was standing at the base of it, and nothing in the library had altered that fact in the smallest degree. She believed this. She had a gift for believing the accurate thing. What she could not quite manage was her body, which had noticed that he stood very still when he was listening, and that his voice in an empty room had a quality it did not have in company, and that his hands, when they released their grip, were the hands of a man who had been holding something with great effort for a very long time. The second time Lady Conworth voiced her opinion, they were at Mrs. Pelling's card party, which Nora attended, because Mrs. Alderton believed the governess ought to have some exposure to society on her half-days, and which she regretted attending within the first quarter of an hour. Lady Conworth had not seen her at first, or had seen her and had decided to wait, which amounted to the same event arriving at different times. She said it to Miss Vane, in the gap between one card table and another, in a carrying voice that was not quite directed at Nora, but was not quite not. The portionless bride. One does wonder at what point perseverance becomes an embarrassment. She had a young man, I understand, before her father died. He removed himself quite sensibly once the debts became clear. One cannot blame him. What is there to marry, after all, when there is nothing to bring to the arrangement? Miss Vane made the sound she made, which was not quite laughter and not quite agreement, but occupied the space between them in a way that served as both. Nora kept her eyes on the card in her hand. The 8 of spades. She thought about the 8 of spades with great focused attention, for the space of perhaps 3 seconds, and then she put it down and made her play, and lost the round and went home. The young man in question was Mr. Charles Westbrook, who had called on her twice in the autumn of her father's illness, and not called again after the solicitor's letter became common knowledge, and whom Nora did not think about very often because he was not worth the energy. What she thought about, in the cold of the coach home, was the specific accuracy of what Lady Conworth had said. There was not, in the strict arithmetic of the marriage market, a great deal to marry. This was the truth. She had been trained to understand it with precision. What she had not been trained for was the morning 2 days later, when she found the Marquess in the schoolroom. He had come in while Hugh was reading aloud from Crabbe, and Dora was arguing with her addition, which Dora did, on principle, regardless of whether she had gotten it right. The Marquess stood in the doorway, and something in his stillness drew Nora's attention before she registered what she was seeing. He was watching her teach, not the children, her. She was at the board where she had written out a set of sums that Dora found objectionable, and she was explaining with patient specificity why 6 and 7 make 13, regardless of what Dora thought they ought to make. She did not know how long he had been there. She was, by the time she registered his presence, deep in a demonstration with the chalk. She turned, and their eyes met, and he did not arrange his expression quickly enough. There was warmth there. Not the warmth of proximity or convenience, but the warmth of a man who is found in an unexpected room, the specific quality of a person he has been watching with care, and who has been seen in the act of watching. She felt it go through her. She kept her face very still. He said nothing. He lifted his chin a fraction, which was not quite a nod, and withdrew. Dora looked at Nora with great 7-year-old attention. "He does that," she said. "He comes to see that things are as they ought to be." "Yes," Nora said. "The sums, Dora." "He came to see that things are as they ought to be." Nora thought about this in the evenings. She sat in her chair, and she thought about it with a precision she applied to all dangerous things, which is to say, carefully and without flinching. She did not allow herself to hope. She understood what hoping would cost her if she were wrong, and she had a clear view of how wrong she could be. The Marquess had lost his wife 2 years ago, and grief did not resolve itself into readiness on any timetable the grieving person could control. She was a governess. He was a Marquess. Lady Conworth had named the arithmetic correctly. What Nora had was the arithmetic. What she did not have was the capacity, it turned out, to govern her own body when he entered a room she occupied. The awareness was physical and specific. The quickening of her breath before she had consciously noted his presence, the particular knowledge of exactly where he stood relative to herself, the warmth that moved across her skin, when his voice came from less than 10 feet away. It was embarrassing. She had not expected to be at the mercy of her own physiology at 4 and 20, and she found the experience undignified. She managed it. She was quite skilled at managing things. November arrived and the Marquess did not leave, and this was unusual enough that even Mrs. Alderton remarked on it, in the mild way she had of remarking on things she did not wish to examine too closely. She remarked it to her housekeeper, and Nora overheard it from the corridor, which was how she learned that Edmund had not stayed at Ashworth through November since his wife died. She filed this information in the place where she kept the things she could not act on, which was becoming quite full. There was an evening in the music room. Nora had gone to practice, as she sometimes did when the children were in bed, and the house was quiet, and she had been playing for perhaps half an hour when she became aware that she was not alone. She did not stop playing. She finished the piece, a Clementi sonata that she had played so many times, it lived in her hands without requiring her mind. And when it was finished, she sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the fire. "Go on," he said from the chair to her right. She turned. He was sitting as though he had been there for some time, which she now understood he had. And his face had the particular quality she had seen in the library. The composure was present, but in a different arrangement than usual. "My lord," she said, "I did not know the room was being used." "It was not," he said. "And then it was. Play the Clementi again." She played it again. Her hands were steadier than they had any right to be. When she finished the second time, he said, "My wife played." He paused. "Not well. She played with great enthusiasm, and very little accuracy. It drove her teacher to despair." Nora heard the tenderness in this, which is different from the grief. Though it lives in the same room, "You are not playing to be heard," he said. "You are playing because the house is quiet, and you are alone. There is a difference." She looked at him. "She played to be heard," he said. "She liked an audience. She would have performed that Clementi as though it were the most important thing happening anywhere in England." He stopped. "I liked watching her play it." "What was her name?" Nora asked, and then wished she had not, because it was too much. "Harriet," he said, and said it the way you say a word that you have not said aloud in a long time and have therefore not noticed how heavy it still is. Nora said, "She sounds like someone one would have been glad to know." He looked at her for a long time. The fire put light on one side of his face and left the other in shadow, and she could see the precise moment his composure returned, assembled piece by piece, and she was sorry for it because she thought it cost him something. "Good night, Miss Cavendish," he said. "Good night, my lord." Quote. She walked to her sitting room and stood at the window and looked out at the park and said to herself, very quietly, that this was not a man who was going to cross any room for her benefit. He was a man who was learning to be present in a house that had been painful for him, and she happened to be in the house. And that was all. She said this to herself very clearly. She believed it imperfectly. The darkest moment arrived in the form of a letter, though dark moments often do, when they want to be efficient about their business. She received it from her father's solicitor on a Thursday morning in December, and she read it in her sitting room before the children's lessons, and she sat for a while after reading it with the letter in her lap and the fire burning low. The solicitor had discovered in the final accounting of her father's estate a second creditor. The amount was not large by the standards of Ashworth. It was very large by the standards of a governess. She could manage it over time. She had been managing over time. The letter arrived in the same week as something else, which was a note from Mrs. Pelling, passed to her at the draper's by a woman she had thought was at least neutrally disposed toward her, informing her that Lady Conworth had spoken to Mrs. Alderton and that Lady Conworth had expressed the opinion that a woman of Miss Cavendish's particular situation and history was not a suitable influence on a marquisate's children, and that it would be a very great pity if the current arrangement were to suffer for the association. Mrs. Alderton had said nothing to Nora. She was the kind of woman who chose her battles with precision, and Lady Conworth had considerable weight in Ashworth's social economy, and Nora knew with the same cold clarity with which she had known all the other uncomfortable things, that her position here was not secure. She sat with the letter from the solicitor and the note from Mrs. Pelling and the fire that was burning low, and she thought about what it meant to have outlasted every other option and to have arrived at a new one. She did not weep. She had learned, somewhere between her father's illness and the solicitor's first letter, that weeping was an expense she could not consistently afford. She thought about the children, about Hugh's insect catalogue and Dora's arithmetic arguments, and the way they had by degree begun to behave as though her presence were expected and dependable, which is the closest that children get to saying they have come to rely on someone. She thought about the library and the music room and the kitchen garden and a pair of gray eyes that had looked at her in the schoolroom with something she had not been able to name with certainty, but had not been able to dismiss either. Then she folded both pieces of paper and put them in the drawer where she kept the things that required action she could not yet take, and she went down to the schoolroom. It was Hugh who told the Marquess. She did not know this until later. Hugh had been in the corridor outside her sitting room, which 9-year-old boys sometimes are when they have a question they are working toward asking, and he had heard enough. He had gone directly to his brother. With the same methodical gravity, he applied to the insect catalogue, and he had reported what he had overheard. She did not know any of this on the morning of the market square. She knew only that Lady Conworth would be there because Lady Conworth was always at the market on Tuesdays, and that she needed linen, and that her back was straight, and her chin was level, and she would do what needed doing, and go home. She had been at the draper's stall for perhaps 10 minutes, when the sound of a horse came from the far end of the square. The Marquess of Alderton did not ordinarily come to the market. The market knew this. The market registered the sound of his horse the way a crowd registers anything unexpected. First a small pause, then a ripple of attention, then the collective rearrangement of attention toward the source. He dismounted at the edge of the square, and a boy materialized to take the reins. And he walked into the market with his coat very dark against the pale morning, and his eyes on the space directly ahead of him. And what was ahead of him was the draper's stall. Was Nora. She saw him when he was still 30 feet away, and she understood, with the cold precision that her body had acquired as a survival mechanism, that something was happening that she had not arranged. She did not move. She stood with her basket and her mended gloves, and she waited. He walked through the market without stopping. Not the walk of a man running an errand. It was the walk of a man going somewhere. Lady Conworth was 5 feet to Nora's left. Miss Vane was at her shoulder. The market crowd had done the thing that market crowds do, which is the collective management of observation. Everyone looking without appearing to look, everyone attending while appearing to be occupied elsewhere. He stopped in front of Nora. He was close enough that she could see the gray of his eyes very clearly, and they were fixed on her face with the quality of attention she had seen in the schoolroom. The quality, she had told herself, did not mean what it appeared to mean. He did not speak immediately. He looked at her for the space of 3 seconds, which is long in a market square. And then he did something she had not expected. He knelt. It was not theatrical. It was the quiet, deliberate act of a man who had arrived at a decision and was carrying it out with the same careful attention he brought to everything. One knee on the cobblestone, his hat in his hand, his eyes on her face. "The market square went very still, Miss Cavendish," he said, and his voice was level and quiet and carried the way things carry in silence. "I have called on your solicitor this morning. The matter of the debt is settled." She opened her mouth. He continued, "I have also spoken to my mother, whose opinion on the subject of Lady Conworth's interference I will not repeat in public, but whose position I believe she will communicate to the relevant parties by the end of the day." Nora said, "My lord, you should not." Her voice was steady. She was rather proud of its steadiness. "I should not have waited this long," he said. "I am aware of that." He held her gaze. "I'm asking you, Miss Nora Cavendish, in this square and before these witnesses, whether you will do me the honor of becoming my wife. 12 words. 12 words. Level and specific and irrevocable." She heard Lady Conworth's breath, very close to her left ear. She looked at him, at this man who had named his wife's laugh in the library, and sat in the music room in the dark, and had asked nothing of her and had watched her with everything. She was going to say, yes. She had known it before the first syllable. What she needed was the moment after the knowing, the held breath before the word, because the word would change everything, and she wanted to have stood inside the last second before it was changed. "Yes?" she said. "My lord." "Yes." He rose. He was very close, close enough that the breath between them was almost not there, and he took her right hand, the one with the glove mended imperfectly at the thumb, and he held it with the care of a man handling something that he understands to be valuable. The market square breathed somewhere to the left. Mrs. Pelling made a small sound. Miss Vane was very still. Lady Conworth's posture, which had been the posture of a woman in complete confidence of her social position, had undergone a change that was visible at a distance of 5 feet. Not collapse, not cruelty, but the particular adjustment of a person who has arrived at a scene they did not script and must now recalculate. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that would serve her. Nora looked at her, and she thought of poor thing, and portionless and persists, and she felt what was in her chest, and it was not triumph. It was quieter than that. It was the warmth that comes when the arithmetic you have been carrying for 7 months turns out to have had a different answer than the one you had been told to expect, and someone with good arithmetic has come to show you. He walked beside her out of the market square, and the crowd parted for them, and his hand was at her elbow with the light specific pressure that she had learned to understand, as his version of reassurance which did not announce itself but was unmistakably present. There are proper things in this world, and then there is what a person owes themselves, and sometimes they are the same thing, and sometimes they are not, and the knowledge of which is the particular education that life provides when it decides to be thorough about your instruction. The banns were called the following Sunday, in the church at the edge of Ashworth village, where the churchyard is enclosed by a stone wall the color of winter cloud, and the vicar read the names in his measured way, and in the third pew from the front sat Mrs. Alderton, who had the expression of a woman who has been waiting for something to resolve itself and has finally been given the satisfaction. Hugh had taken his insect notebook to the service and spent the third reading drawing a beetle of particular accuracy. Dora sat next to Nora and held her hand very tightly through the whole of the vicar's address, not in a childlike way, but in the way of someone who has decided that the available security ought to be distributed with care, and who takes the distribution seriously. Nora held her hand back. The December light came through the old glass of the church in pieces, gold and pale blue, falling across the stone floor in the particular way that winter morning light falls in English churches, which is the light that has no rival for quiet beauty. She did not look at Edmund. She could feel him, 2 feet to her right, with the same specific involuntary awareness she had been managing for 8 weeks. She did not look. She kept her eyes forward and her hand around Dora's, and she listened to the names being read, her own among them, and she let them settle into the cold air of the church without requiring anything more from them than what they were. Which was enough, which was, as it turned out, everything. The morning of the wedding was cold and clear, the sky over Ashworth, the pale gray blue of frost before the sun has decided what to do with it. The ceremony was small. Only Mrs. Alderton, the children, the vicar, the 2 witnesses who were the estate steward and his wife, who had been at Ashworth for 30 years, and were quietly and firmly delighted. She wore a gown of cream wool with a high neck and no particular ornament, because she had no particular ornament to wear, and her hair was dressed by Mrs. Alderton's maid with a string of small garnets that Mrs. Alderton had pressed upon her that morning with the no-nonsense efficiency she applied to everything. Edmund was waiting at the front of the church. He turned when she entered, and he looked at her with the gray eyes that had looked at her in the kitchen garden and the library and the music room and the schoolroom in the market square, and his expression was the same each time, which was the expression of a man who is looking at a thing that is actually there and who intends to go on looking. She walked the length of the church, which was short, and the December light fell through the old glass and put pieces of pale gold on the stone, and Dora was in the front pew with her hands folded in her lap and her chin extremely high, and Hugh was drawing a moth in the corner of his service book, and the vicar had his words ready. The ring Edmund placed on her hand had a garnet at its center, the deep red of winter berries, and it was the right size, which was not an accident. She had noticed in the days since the market square that he attended to details with a great care, and the size of a ring is a detail that requires attention. She said the words that were asked of her. He said the words that were asked of him, in the voice that carried without requiring elevation, and they were the same words that have been said in cold English churches for as long as there have been cold English churches, and they were sufficient. They walked out of the church into the December air, and Dora immediately seized Nora's free hand, and Hugh fell into step beside his brother with a companionable gravity, and the four of them crossed the churchyard with the frost under their feet, and the old stone wall on either side, and the sky very pale and high above them. She did not know, walking out of the church, that the afternoon would bring a note from Lady Conworth, written in the careful penmanship of a woman who had recalculated, and arrived at a gracious position with the same efficiency with which she arrived at all her positions. She did not know that Mrs. Pelling would call the following week with a warmth so perfectly calibrated, it was almost comic. She did not know that Miss Vane would, within the month, become engaged to a Lincolnshire landowner of moderate income and great sociability, and that this would suit her better than the Marquess would have done. She knew only this: the frost on the cobblestones of the churchyard, and the weight of the garnet on her finger, and Edmund's hand at her elbow, and Dora's hand in her own, and Hugh's methodical footstep alongside. And the library, that first evening when they were home, and the children were in bed, and the fire was high. She sat in the chair that was not her chair any longer, but was now simply the chair by the fire, and he sat opposite, and the silence between them was the silence of a room that two people have agreed to share, which is a different quiet from the quiet of a room one occupies alone. She had the cowper in her lap. She did not open it. She looked at the fire, and then she looked at him, and he was looking at her already. "Harriet would have liked you," he said. "She would have found you worth watching." It was the most careful thing he could have said, and she understood that he had been holding it for some time, and had decided this was the moment to put it down. "I am glad," she said. And she was. She was entirely glad. Outside, the first snow of the winter had begun, soft and unhurried, settling on the park and the stone wall and the kitchen garden where the chrysanthemums had finally gone to seed, covering everything in the particular quietness of the first snow, which is the quietness that carries its own quiet declaration. The year has made its accounting, and what comes next begins clean. She turned the garnet on her finger, once the way you return to a thing that is entirely yours to return to, and she listened to the fire and the snow and the house that was. At last, her house. If you have stayed until the end of Nora's story, leave your thoughts below. Stories like this one live in the quiet moments, and so do the people who tell them. The snow went on falling, soft and without hurry, as though the world had nowhere particular to be, and all the time in the world to get there.